The morning fog clung to the cottage like a living thing, obscuring all but the immediate world of grey stone and darker earth. Eleanor Wynne stood at her threshold, a modest porcelain teacup held between her palms, its warmth the only certainty in the pale dawn. The cup bore a thin crack along its rim, a fissure she had chosen not to repair, for it served her purpose now more faithfully than any pristine vessel could. He was there again, as he had been for 9 mornings past, his thin frame folded against the corner of her garden wall, the Shivering Man. She did not know his name, nor whence he had come. He appeared as the autumn deepened, manifesting at her property's edge like a spectre, drawn to warmth rather than mercy. Yet Eleanor had learned that mercy and warmth were often the same thing, offered in the same gesture. "Your tea, sir," she said softly, descending the 2 stone steps with deliberate care. Her voice carried neither pity nor curiosity, only the measured gentleness one might extend to an injured bird. "It is still hot. The chamomile will ease the trembling if you permit it." He accepted the cup without meeting her eyes, his fingers, bruised with cold, wrapping around the porcelain as though it alone tethered him to the waking world. This too had become ritual. She would descend, he would accept. Neither would speak beyond the barest courtesy. And yet, with each passing morning, Eleanor felt the peculiar warmth of an act rendered into constancy. The village would have called her foolish. Mrs. Lydia Renshaw, the warden's wife, had already begun her whispered campaign. Eleanor had heard the murmurs in the market, the warnings that a young woman of modest station, harbouring a vagrant, invited ruin upon her name. The church had its protocols. Mrs. Renshaw proclaimed, and charity administered without sanction was merely presumption cloaked in virtue. But Eleanor had learned long ago that the official channels of kindness were often the slowest. Her father, the retired schoolmaster, had taught her that some acts of grace must be undertaken in the small hours, witnessed only by conscience and the early birds. "Will you not sit?" she offered now, indicating the worn wooden bench beside her cottage door. The gesture was bolder than her usual offerings. In the 9 mornings she had never invited him into her immediate space, never suggested anything beyond the transaction of cup and gratitude. For the first time, his eyes lifted. They were hazel, she noted, a soft hazel touched with confusion, as though he were perpetually awakening from a dream he could not name. "I should not," he said, his voice carrying the roughened edges of disuse. "It is not proper. That is to say, your reputation—" "My reputation," Eleanor replied with a quiet firmness, "is my own concern, sir, and it seems to me that a cup of tea offered in the morning hours can scarcely be construed as impropriety, no matter how narrow Mrs. Renshaw's imaginings grow." A tremor moved through him, not from cold, she sensed, but from something closer to shame. He sank slowly onto the bench, still cradling the cup as though it were a thing more precious than gold. Eleanor settled beside him, maintaining the distance that propriety demanded, yet close enough that her presence might convey what words could not, that he was not merely tolerated, but witnessed. They sat in silence as the fog began its slow dissolution. The village beyond remained shuttered and sleeping. Eleanor found her gaze drawn to his profile, the sharp angles of a face that had known hunger, the way his jaw worked as though grinding through some internal sorrow. She wondered, as she had wondered each preceding morning, what catastrophe had reduced him to this threshold, this borrowed warmth. "You are very kind," he said at last, the words arriving as though drawn from some deep, reluctant well. "Kindness without expectation of return is rare in this world. I fear I am unworthy of—" "Worthiness," Eleanor interrupted gently, "is not a prerequisite for decency, sir. We are all of us worthy of warmth. That is what my father taught me in his final years. It is all that remains true after fortune has been stripped away." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she perceived something shift, a recognition, perhaps, that she spoke not from abstract virtue, but from intimate knowledge of diminishment. The cup continued to steam between his hands. It was then that Eleanor heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of carriage wheels upon the road that skirted the village. The wheels were fine, the sort that belonged to persons of consequence. They drew nearer with each passing moment, the hoofbeats of matched horses marking their inexorable approach. The Shivering Man's entire frame stiffened. The cup trembled visibly in his grip. "Do not be alarmed," Eleanor said, though she herself felt the subtle quickening of her pulse. "It is likely only the post, or perhaps—" But the carriage did not continue past her cottage. Instead, it slowed. The wheels crunched against the gravel of her modest garden path, and the matched pair of black horses came to a halt directly before her gate. Upon the carriage door, illuminated even through the thinning fog, was a seal, a ducal seal, cast in gold leaf and bearing the unmistakable weight of heraldic authority. The shivering man rose so suddenly that the teacup fell from his hands, shattering against the stone step with a sound like breaking glass. Eleanor stared at the shattered porcelain, then at the carriage, and finally at the man whose entire countenance had transformed into something between recognition and terror, as though the very heavens had opened to pronounce judgment. 3 weeks had elapsed since the arrival of the carriage, yet Eleanor found that time had assumed a peculiar elasticity. The days unfolded with the weight of hours, each moment laden with a significance that ordinarily belonged to years. The shivering man, she now knew him as Thomas, though the full extent of his identity remained veiled behind the careful restraint of unspoken understanding, had been conveyed away that morning in the ducal carriage, his departure so swift and absolute that Eleanor had half convinced herself it had been a vision born of autumn mist. Yet he had returned, not to her doorstep, but to the cottage itself, installed in the small guest chamber with the Duke's explicit instruction that Eleanor should continue the ministrations that had proven so restorative to his person. The Duke himself had not appeared again, though his presence permeated every arrangement, every careful provision. Letters arrived weekly from the ducal solicitor, assuring Eleanor that her services were valued and would be appropriately compensated. But it was the seal upon those letters that haunted her, that same golden seal from the carriage, now forever linked in her mind to the moment when the ordinary world had fractured irreparably. It was on a Wednesday afternoon when Mrs. Lydia Renshaw appeared at Eleanor's door, her silhouette framed by the November light with all the inevitability of approaching storm. "I have come, Mrs." Renshaw announced, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for moral judgment, "to ascertain the truth of certain matters that have begun to circulate within the parish. It is my duty, as wife of the warden, to ensure that our community maintains standards of propriety befitting Christian society." Eleanor gestured for her visitor to enter, though she sensed already the tenor of this visit. "Mrs." Renshaw's eyes swept the modest parlor with the calculating precision of one cataloguing evidence for an indictment. "The rumors," Mrs. Renshaw continued, settling herself upon the edge of Eleanor's best chair as though it were contaminated, "concern the presence of a gentleman, or rather a man of questionable station, residing within this cottage. A man whom you have been attending with what can only be described as unseemly familiarity. The village speaks of nothing else. Your name, Miss Wynne, has become the subject of considerable speculation." Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always accompanied confrontation, yet she kept her voice level. "My engagement with the gentleman in question is undertaken under the direct sanction of his family, Mrs. Renshaw. His health required attention, and I have provided it. Surely that speaks to my commitment to Christian charity, rather than diminishing it." "His family, Mrs." Renshaw's eyebrow arched with theatrical incredulity. "A vagrant with connections to family of consequence? I find the matter exceedingly suspicious. It is far more likely that you have been deceived, Miss Wynne, or that you yourself have engaged in some scheme to elevate your circumstances through association with this mysterious personage." The accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor rose, her composure fragile but intact. "I assure you, Mrs. Renshaw, my actions have been dictated entirely by conscience and the explicit wishes of those responsible for this gentleman's welfare." "Conscience?" Mrs. Renshaw repeated, her tone suggesting the word itself was somehow soiled by Eleanor's utterance of it. "How convenient a justification for impropriety. I have come to warn you, Miss Wynne, that should this situation persist, I shall be compelled to bring the matter before the ecclesiastical authorities. The reputation of this parish must be preserved, and if you will not attend to the preservation of your own character, then I shall do it for you." She rose with the satisfaction of one who has delivered a mortal wound, her shawl drawn about her shoulders with the finality of a curse. At the threshold she paused. "You would do well to remove yourself from this situation before you find yourself utterly ruined, Miss Wynne. Some reputations, once lost, cannot be recovered." The door closed with a softness that belied the violence of her departure. Eleanor sank into her chair, trembling not from fear, but from the terrible awareness that Mrs. Renshaw's words, however maliciously intended, contained a kernel of truth. She had been imprudent. She had allowed her compassion to overrule the caution that a woman of her circumstances could ill afford to abandon. It was this despair that possessed her when the letter arrived the following morning. The envelope bore no seal nor any mark of origin. Inside, written in a careful but irregular hand, were words that transformed her trepidation into something approaching panic. "Miss Wynne, I write to you in cipher, for disclosure would endanger all parties to this correspondence. I have observed that the gentleman residing in your cottage is the subject of considerable interest to those who would wish him harm. His departure from a certain establishment was not entirely voluntary, and there are those who have made it their business to locate him. A sum of money, substantial, but not so much as to draw attention, has been offered for information regarding his whereabouts. I urge you to exercise the greatest caution. The gentleman's family does not yet comprehend the extent of the threat posed by those who pursue him. A letter will arrive soon, directing further action. Burn this missive and confide in no one." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading generating fresh waves of comprehension and dread. Thomas was in danger, not merely from the machinery of social censure, but from something far darker and more immediate. The peaceful ministrations of the past weeks, the careful restoration of his faculties through warmth and gentle conversation, had all occurred within the shadow of a threat she had not perceived. She moved to the hearth and consigned the letter to the flames, watching as the paper curled and blackened, as though by destroying the physical document she might somehow arrest the reality it described. But the words remained branded in her memory, impossible to purge through any act of fire. That evening, when Thomas came to take his supper in the small dining room, Eleanor observed him with new eyes. He was stronger now. The colour had returned to his cheeks, and the trembling had subsided to the point of near invisibility. Yet she perceived too the fragility that underlay his recovery, the sense that he remained tethered to consciousness by only the most delicate of threads. "You are troubled, Miss Wynne," he said gently, setting down his spoon. "Your distress is written across your countenance with perfect clarity. Will you not confide in me? I have imposed upon your charity with increasing shamelessness, and it seems only just that I should bear some portion of whatever burden now weighs upon you." Eleanor looked at him across the candle-lit table and felt something crystallize within her, a resolve born of fear and tenderness in equal measure. She could not tell him of the letter, not yet, but neither could she allow her silence to become a form of deception. "There is a matter," she said slowly, "concerning the propriety of your remaining here. The village grows restless. I fear that my reputation, modest though it may be, is becoming a liability to your recovery and to your family's interests." Thomas's face darkened. He set down his utensils with deliberate care. "Then I shall depart. My presence, however well-intentioned your care, cannot justify the destruction of your standing in this community." "No," Eleanor said, and the word emerged with a firmness that surprised them both. "You shall not depart. Whatever comes, whatever threats arrange themselves against us, flight is not the answer. The answer lies in truth, clearly spoken and publicly acknowledged." In the candlelight, she saw something flicker across his features, a recognition of her resolve, and perhaps something more tender, something that resembled the first faint glimmering of hope. The letter, when it arrived 4 days hence, bore the formal letterhead of a London solicitor, a gentleman of some repute whose name appeared frequently in the property transactions of the county. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the seal, aware even before reading that this communication represented a turning point from which no retreat would be possible. "To Miss Eleanor Wynne, the bearer of this letter acts upon the explicit authority of His Grace the Duke of Rothden, and comes to you in a matter of the utmost discretion. Recent intelligence has come to light suggesting that certain parties, whose names need not be enumerated but whose intentions are decidedly malevolent, have fixed their attention upon the whereabouts of Mr. Thomas Harrowby, the Duke's brother. It has become evident that Mr. Harrowby's recent affliction and subsequent disappearance were not matters of happenstance, but rather the consequence of deliberate malice, orchestrated by those who stand to gain materially from his continued invalidism, or, in the extremity, from his demise. His Grace has entrusted me with the delicate task of ensuring Mr. Harrowby's safety, whilst simultaneously ascertaining the precise nature and origins of the threat arrayed against him. Your role in Mr. Harrowby's recovery has not gone unnoticed, nor unappreciated. The medical practitioners engaged by the Duke expressed their astonishment at the rapidity of his brother's restoration, attributing this improvement primarily to the constancy of your ministrations and the remarkably therapeutic effects of your presence. It is therefore the Duke's wish that you continue in your present capacity, whilst also granting access to 2 agents of discretion who will establish themselves within the village under the pretense of distant relations newly come to lodge with the vicar. These gentlemen will undertake such investigations as may be necessary to identify those who seek Mr. Harrowby's location and to neutralize the threat they represent. Furthermore, the Duke requests that you wear the enclosed ring at all times, visible upon your person. This ring bears the secondary seal of the Harrowby house and will serve as credential sufficient to command assistance from any quarter where the Duke's influence obtains. Should you find yourself in circumstances demanding immediate intervention, present this ring and speak the name Rothden with authority. Your discretion and compassion are acknowledged as virtues rarely encountered. The Duke trusts you as he has learned to trust few in this world. Your obedient servant, Mr. Edmund Blackwood, solicitor. Enclosed with the letter was a ring of considerable weight, fashioned from white gold, and bearing upon its face a seal that matched precisely the one Eleanor had observed upon the carriage, but rendered in miniature, wrought with such intricacy that the heraldic details seemed to possess their own subtle radiance. Eleanor sank into her chair, the letter trembling in her grasp. The magnitude of what had been revealed, the deliberate poisoning of Thomas, the calculating malice of unseen enemies, the Duke's intervention on a scale that begat agents and investigations, transformed her understanding of the preceding weeks entirely. She had believed herself a modest instrument of charity. Instead, she had become, all unaware, a linchpin in a drama of family protection and aristocratic power. It was this revelation that she carried to Thomas that evening, in the privacy of the library where a fire burned low against the advancing darkness of November. "I must confess something to you," she began, settling herself in the chair opposite his own. "Your safety, Mr. Harrowby, has been endangered in ways that I was not initially privy to. But I have just received correspondence from your brother's solicitor that necessitates our speaking with complete candor." She produced both the letter and the ring, and watched as Thomas's countenance underwent a series of transformations, first confusion, then comprehension, and finally a deep and visible anguish. "My brother has drawn you into this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Eleanor, forgive my presumption in addressing you so. He has placed you at risk to protect me. This is insupportable. I shall not permit it. The decision was not made by us, Mr. Harrowby," Eleanor replied gently, noting that he had employed her Christian name and finding in that transgression a kind of permission to speak with greater intimacy. "Your brother, it seems, has rendered his own judgment regarding the matter, and I confess that I would not wish to be removed from this service, however perilous it may prove. Your recovery, your restoration to yourself, has become a matter of consequence to me that transcends prudence." Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, his silhouette rendered sharp against the firelight. "You do not comprehend what you are saying. My affliction was not accidental. I was poisoned, Eleanor, slowly, methodically, by someone I trusted utterly. My cousin, believing that my incapacity might lead to the reassignment of certain family properties into his own control, administered a substance whose effects were designed to render me incapable of managing my own affairs and eventually to remove me from the succession entirely." "But your brother discovered this," Eleanor ventured. "My brother discovered it," Thomas confirmed, "and set about undoing the damage while simultaneously concealing the nature of my affliction from the wider family. It is a credit to his discretion and a condemnation of my own weakness that it required a stranger's kindness to effect my restoration when my own blood proved insufficient to the task." He turned to face her, and in the firelight Eleanor perceived the full weight of his regard, a regard that carried within it both gratitude and something far more complicated. "You have given me back my dignity, Eleanor, not through pity, but through the steadfast refusal to treat my circumstances as though they diminished my worth. In doing so, you have become the only truth in a world otherwise composed of shadows and deceit." Eleanor's breath caught. She rose, the ring still clutched in her palm, and moved toward him. "Then let us meet this peril together, Mr. Harrowby. Whatever comes, whatever revelations attend this investigation, we shall face it as allies rather than as the solitary sufferers we have each been." Thomas reached out and took her hand, the gesture devoid of impropriety, yet carrying an intimacy that transcended mere propriety. He turned her palm upward and slipped the ring upon her finger, positioning it with deliberate care. "This ring," he said softly, marks you as under the protection of the Harrowby name, but it should mark you as something far more. Eleanor, I scarcely dare speak the words, yet circumstance demands it. You have become essential to my restoration, not merely my recovery, but the very possibility of redemption. If you would permit it, I would wish, when this darkness has lifted, to ask you something far more substantial than gratitude permits. Eleanor's heart seemed to suspend its beating. She understood precisely what remained unspoken, and in that understanding found a terror and a joy so intermingled that she could not distinguish one from the other. We must be cautious, she whispered. There are proprieties that even affection cannot circumvent. Proprieties, Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of defiance, have already been thoroughly violated. What remains is to determine whether we shall permit the world's judgment to govern us, or whether we shall govern it through the sheer force of our commitment to truth. But even as he spoke, Eleanor heard, carried upon the evening wind, the sound of horses approaching the cottage, multiple riders, moving with purpose. The agents Blackwood had promised, or something far more sinister. In that moment of uncertainty, she felt Thomas's fingers tighten around her own, and found in that pressure the only certainty the night could offer. The riders who arrived as darkness settled fully upon the village proved to be neither threat nor salvation, but rather something between two gentlemen of indeterminate age, possessed of the quiet efficiency that marked men accustomed to operating beyond the boundaries of ordinary law. They introduced themselves as Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Ashford, distant cousins of the vicar, come to lodge in the parish whilst conducting certain mercantile investigations. Eleanor perceived immediately that their story was a fiction maintained for the benefit of the village, and that their true purpose lay in the shadowed investigations alluded to in Blackwood's correspondence. It was Mr. Pritchard who presented Eleanor with the intelligence gathered over the preceding fortnight. They sat in the library, the door secured, whilst Thomas occupied himself in his chamber above, deliberately absenting himself to preserve whatever appearance of propriety might yet be salvaged. "The threat originates," Mr. Pritchard explained, his tone carrying the flat affect of one accustomed to delivering grave tidings, "from Mr. James Harrowby, the Duke's cousin. The poisoning of Mr. Thomas was undertaken not upon his own initiative, but rather at the direction of a London moneylender to whom Mr. James has become substantially indebted. The moneylender, a gentleman known in certain circles as Dalziel, has connections to a criminal syndicate whose interests extend across the county and into the metropolitan areas. Mr. James's debts exceed £40,000, a sum he cannot conceivably settle through legitimate means." Eleanor felt the room seem to tilt. £40,000 represented a figure so vast as to be nearly incomprehensible, a sum that could sustain an ordinary family for generations. "The scheme, as we understand it," Mr. Pritchard continued, "was predicated upon the assumption that Mr. Thomas's incapacity would lead to the temporary reassignment of the Harrowby properties and rents into Mr. James's management. With access to such resources, he believed himself capable of satisfying his creditors. However, the Duke's protective intervention prevented the realization of this plan. "Where is Mr. James now?" Eleanor asked, though some portion of her already suspected the answer. "He has fled to the continent, likely to France or the Low Countries. However, Dalziel has not abandoned his claim upon the Harrowby family. Indeed, intelligence suggests that he has now directed his attention toward Mr. Thomas himself, calculating that the elimination of Mr. Thomas might yet serve his purposes by destabilizing the ducal succession and creating the circumstance necessary to coerce cooperation from His Grace." Eleanor pressed her fingers to her temples. "Then Mr. Thomas remains in mortal danger, so long as he remains unguarded and undeclared." "Precisely," Mr. Ashford interjected, "which is why His Grace has determined that Mr. Thomas must be removed from this location, not to safety, but to visibility. The Duke has arranged for his brother to be brought before the magistrate, where a formal petition shall be filed, accusing Mr. James of attempted murder through poisoning. Once the matter becomes a subject of legal proceeding and public record, Mr. Thomas's elimination ceases to offer Dalziel any advantage. Indeed, it would precipitate the very consequences Mr. Dalziel seeks to avoid." "When is this to occur?" Eleanor asked, though her voice seemed to come from some distance outside herself. 3 days hence, a carriage will arrive to convey Mr. Thomas to the county seat. The magistrate has been apprised of the situation and stands ready to receive testimony. The legal proceeding will be conducted with all necessary publicity to ensure that word reaches Dalziel and his associates that Mr. Thomas has moved beyond their reach. After the agents had departed, Eleanor sat alone in the library, the weight of this knowledge settling upon her like a physical thing. Thomas would be removed from her home. His testimony, however necessary, would expose him to scrutiny and potential threat, and the intimate connection that had begun to crystallize between them would be severed by the demands of propriety and circumstance. She found him in his chamber, standing at the window as though he had been awaiting this moment. "I know," he said simply, not turning from his contemplation of the darkened garden. "The agents informed me before they presented their findings to you. I heard their voices in the hall." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly but not quite touching his own. "You must go. You must submit to your brother's protection and the law's machinery. There is no alternative." "I am aware," Thomas replied. His voice carried a note of resignation, but beneath it ran a current of something else. Resolve, perhaps, or acceptance of a pain that could not be circumvented. "What I find insupportable is the separation this necessitates. Eleanor, in the span of mere weeks, you have become the singular truth in my existence. To part from you now, when our understanding is so recently achieved, seems a cruelty that even divine providence scarcely merits." Eleanor allowed her hand to find his, their fingers intertwining in the darkness. "We are not so easily separated, Mr. Harrowby. Whatever distance physical circumstance may impose, the bond of understanding we have forged cannot be diminished by mere geography." "Mere geography," Thomas repeated, his voice touching upon irony. "You are generous in your interpretation of what the world will present as necessity. I leave this cottage not merely removed from your proximity, but exposed to legal proceedings that may well drag my family's shame into the light of public examination. Your association with me, with a man whose reputation is already compromised, may well become a source of renewed scandal for you." "Then let it," Eleanor said with sudden vehemence. "I am no longer willing to order my life according to the judgments of persons like Mrs. Renshaw, who measure virtue by the absence of risk, rather than by its courageous embrace. You have taught me, through your very presence and your suffering, that true nobility resides not in the avoidance of difficulty, but in the steadfast commitment to honor despite it." Thomas turned to face her fully, and in the faint light from the window, Eleanor perceived the remarkable transformation that had occurred in his countenance since that first morning when he had been a mere spectre of humanity, shivering against her garden wall. He was whole now, restored not merely in body but in spirit. "If I were to survive this trial," he said slowly, "if the law were to vindicate my innocence and neutralize the threat arrayed against us, would you, Eleanor, would you permit me to speak to my brother? Would you allow me to request his blessing for an arrangement that would bind us together, not merely in understanding, but in law and in faith?" Eleanor's breath caught. She understood precisely what he was proposing, and the magnitude of it, the audacity, the tenderness, the absolute defiance of every convention that might counsel caution. "I would," she whispered, "though we must proceed with discretion until your name has been cleared entirely. Once your honor has been publicly restored, once the shadow of scandal has lifted, I would welcome your petition with a joy that propriety scarcely permits me to acknowledge." Thomas raised her hand to his lips, the gesture carrying a weight of commitment that transcended mere courtship. "Then I go to face this trial not as a man stripped of his dignity, but as one who has been granted a vision of redemption more precious than any title or estate. Whatever comes, Eleanor, know that you have saved me, not merely from the poison that sought my destruction, but from the despair that threatened to make that destruction insignificant." He released her hand reluctantly, and in that moment, Eleanor perceived the sacrifice he was making, the necessity of departing without the public acknowledgement that would ordinarily attend such an avowal. They had stepped beyond propriety, yet they must appear to the world as barely acquainted. The weight of that duality would be borne equally by them both. On the following morning, Eleanor dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep green wool and arranging her hair with the precision of one preparing for battle. When the ducal carriage arrived, she stood at her threshold, not to bid farewell to a departing guest, but to maintain the appearance of merely superintending the departure of an unknown gentleman whose stay had become unsuitable. Thomas emerged from the cottage, and Eleanor perceived in his bearing the restoration of the man he had been before affliction had diminished him. He was dressed now in the fine clothing his station demanded, and the transformation was so complete that for a moment she scarcely recognized him. He paused before the carriage, and his eyes found hers across the space that separated them. In that gaze passed all that could not be spoken, all the tenderness, all the commitment, all the desperate hope that circumstances had rendered voiceless. "Miss Wynne," he said formally, bowing with the precision of aristocratic courtesy, "I shall be forever in your debt for the care you have extended during my sojourn in this parish." "Mr. Harrowby," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tempest of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, "I trust you shall find the situation you face resolved to your satisfaction." He took her hand, and in that contact, invisible to any observer, he slipped something into her palm, a small object wrapped in cloth. She understood immediately that it was some material testimony to the commitment he could not voice aloud. "Farewell, Miss Wynne," he said, and the words carried within them all that remained unspoken. The carriage door closed, the matched horses stepped forward, and Eleanor stood alone in her garden as the vehicle bearing Thomas Harrowby disappeared into the November mist, carrying with it the only truth she had discovered in years of careful, restrained existence. Only when the sound of wheels had faded entirely did she open her hand and examine what he had left there. It was a ring, not the ducal seal she wore, but another, fashioned from silver and bearing upon its inner surface an inscription too minute to read in the grey morning light. She would discover in the privacy of her chamber that it read simply, "Truth and Tenderness," and beneath it, the initials T.H. The county magistrate's hall stood upon elevated ground, a Georgian structure of austere elegance that seemed to Eleanor's eyes to embody all the weight of lawful authority. It was here, precisely 6 days after Thomas's departure, that the proceedings against Mr. James Harrowby were scheduled to commence. Eleanor had not been summoned as a witness. Her involvement in Mr. Thomas's recovery would remain, by mutual understanding, unacknowledged in the formal record, yet she found herself compelled, through a force she could not name, to attend the proceedings. She had written to Blackwood, the solicitor, requesting permission to observe from the gallery reserved for the public, and his response had arrived by return post, granting her request with the tacit understanding that her presence would be neither acknowledged nor remarked upon. She dressed with meticulous care, selecting a gown of charcoal grey that spoke of sobriety without suggesting mourning. The silver ring remained upon her finger, hidden beneath her glove, a secret pressed against her skin like a heartbeat made manifest. She had read the inscription 100 times in the intervening days, each reading generating fresh waves of comprehension and tender anguish. The hall filled gradually with the apparatus of rural justice, magistrates in their formal robes, solicitors with their leather cases, witnesses and observers arranged upon the wooden benches like actors assembling upon a stage. Eleanor took her place in the gallery, her position affording her a view of the proceedings without rendering her conspicuous to casual observation. When Thomas entered, guided by one of the agents of discretion, Eleanor felt her breath suspend itself entirely. He was transformed, no longer the recovering invalid, but the full embodiment of his station. He wore a coat of deep charcoal wool, his waistcoat a subtle burgundy that complemented the return of colour to his face. Yet it was not his external restoration that riveted her attention. It was the particular dignity with which he bore himself, the absolute composure that spoke of a man who had traversed darkness and emerged with his honour intact. The magistrate, a gentleman of considerable years and obvious experience, surveyed the assembly with the gravity befitting the occasion. "We are assembled," he intoned, "to hear evidence pertaining to allegations of attempted murder through the administration of noxious substances, the particulars of which concern Mr. James Harrowby, now absent from this jurisdiction. The complainant is Mr. Thomas Harrowby, younger brother to His Grace Adrian Harrowby, Duke of Rothdon. Mr. Harrowby, you may proceed with your testimony." Thomas rose, his voice steady, as he recounted the particulars of his affliction. He spoke of his cousin's financial distress, of conversations overheard in which James's desperation had become increasingly evident. He detailed the progressive nature of his own deterioration, the mounting confusion that had begun 3 months prior, the sense of his own faculties being systematically diminished through some mechanism he could not initially perceive. "I was not unconscious," Thomas explained, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded complete silence from the assembled gathering, but rather trapped within a consciousness that increasingly felt as though it belonged to another person entirely. "I could observe my own decline with perfect clarity, yet I possessed neither the volition nor the capacity to arrest it. It was as though my very self were being systematically erased, leaving behind only the shell of a body that could no longer claim coherence. The medical practitioner engaged by the Duke then presented his findings. Evidence of the particular substance that had been discovered in minute quantities throughout Thomas's chambers, evidence that the substance had been administered through the vehicle of the port wine that James regularly provided as a courtesy to his afflicted cousin. The testimony was technical, presented with the careful precision of science, yet it carried an underlying violence, the revelation of systematic, calculated malice perpetrated by a member of one's own family. Eleanor found her hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails marked crescents in her palms. The public exposure of Thomas's suffering, the anatomization of his affliction before the assembled magistrates and observers, seemed a violation of the privacy that had characterized their connection from its inception. Yet she understood that this exposure was necessary, that only through this public acknowledgement could Thomas's honor be restored and the threat arrayed against him be neutralized. It was then that the Duke himself entered the hall. His Grace Adrian Harrowby moved with the unhurried grace of one accustomed to commanding every space he inhabited. He was taller than Eleanor had anticipated, his presence carrying a weight that seemed to diminish the architecture surrounding him. He wore the formal dress appropriate to his station, yet there was nothing ostentatious in his bearing, only the natural authority of a man who had been raised from birth to the exercise of power. The magistrate rose. The entire assembly seemed to come to attention, as though the physical space had become charged with the electricity of his presence. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, bowing with appropriate deference, "we are honored by your attendance. I trust you have not been personally inconvenienced by these proceedings." "I have come," the Duke replied, his voice carrying the timbre of cultivated authority, "to present evidence that bears directly upon the case under examination. Specifically, I wish to introduce documentation that establishes not merely the fact of Mr. James Harrowby's malice, but the network of obligation and coercion that compelled him to undertake this desperate action." He produced a leather folio, from which he extracted a series of documents, letters, promissory notes, evidence of the debts that had driven James toward the calculated poisoning of his cousin. As these materials were examined by the magistrate and his associates, Eleanor perceived the architecture of malice being dismantled piece by piece, each document another brick removed from the wall of James's desperate scheme. Yet it was what occurred next that rendered the proceedings truly extraordinary. The Duke reached into his waistcoat and produced a seal of wax, red as blood, bearing the unmistakable imprint of the Harrowby crest. He held it aloft, and the assembled gathering fell into profound silence. "This seal," the Duke declared, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "represents not merely the authority of my house, but a personal commitment undertaken this day. I declare before this assembly and before God that the poisoning of my brother, undertaken by elements within my own family, constitutes a betrayal so profound that it severs the bonds of kinship and honor that ordinarily protect familial relationships from legal proceeding. I do not seek to shield Mr. James from the consequences of his actions. I seek instead to ensure that he faces those consequences with full acknowledgement of the gravity of his crime." He turned toward Thomas, and in that moment Eleanor perceived something extraordinary pass between the two brothers, a recognition that transcended mere familial affection. It was the acknowledgement of one who had nearly been destroyed by malice, and another who had borne the weight of that malice upon his own conscience. "My brother," the Duke continued, "has been restored through means that have come to my attention during the course of this investigation. He has been restored through the ministrations of a person possessed of virtue so remarkable that it seems almost unnatural in its constancy. I wish this assembly to know that the Harrowby house does not forget such virtue. We do not abandon those who have aided us in our hour of extremity." His gaze shifted, and Eleanor felt her heart seem to suspend its beating. He was looking toward the gallery, toward her position, though his expression gave no indication that he perceived her. Yet she understood with a certainty that transcended rational thought that he knew of her presence, and that his words, seemingly general in their address, were in fact directed toward her with singular precision. The magistrate pronounced judgment some hours later, as afternoon light slanted through the high windows of the hall. James Harrowby was declared in absentia to have committed the crime of attempted murder, and a warrant was issued for his apprehension. His properties and titles were placed under Crown seizure pending his capture. The sentence, once rendered, seemed almost anticlimactic, merely the legal codification of what had already been made manifest through evidence and testimony. Yet it was only after the formal proceedings had concluded, as the assembled gathering dispersed toward the exits, that Eleanor perceived Blackwood approaching her position in the gallery. "Miss Wynne," the solicitor said, his tone conveying the precise calibration of respect appropriate to her undefined station, "His Grace requests your attendance at Harrowby House this evening. A carriage will call for you at your cottage at 6 o'clock. Appropriate accommodation has been arranged for your journey and your stay." Eleanor's breath caught. "I cannot possibly—" "His Grace anticipates your objections," Blackwood interrupted, his expression suggesting the faintest hint of amusement, "and has directed me to inform you that the matter concerns your own future with some immediacy. The carriage will arrive at 6 o'clock, Miss Wynne. I trust you will not find it necessary to decline his invitation." The solicitor departed before Eleanor could formulate a response, leaving her alone in the now emptying gallery, her fingers trembling against the wooden rail before her. The ducal carriage that arrived precisely at 6 o'clock bore the Harrowby crest in gilded relief upon its doors. Eleanor had spent the preceding hours in a state of anxious preparation that scarcely approached coherence. She had changed her gown 3 times, settled upon the charcoal dress she had worn to the magistrate's proceedings, then reconsidered in favor of a more austere burgundy wool that spoke of dignity without presumption. She had secured her hair with meticulous care, pinned the silver ring once more beneath her glove, and attempted to still the tumultuous succession of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought. The cottage had never seemed smaller, nor the world beyond it more vast and unknowable. Harrowby House emerged from the darkening landscape like something conjured from architectural reverie, a great structure of honey-colored stone, its windows ablaze with candlelight, that transformed the facade into something approaching an incandescent vision. Eleanor had expected grandeur, certainly, but the magnitude of what she perceived as the carriage drew to a halt before the principal entrance rendered her previous imaginings almost quaint in their limitations. A footman assisted her from the carriage, his manner suggesting that he perceived nothing extraordinary in the arrival of a modest woman of the village. She was conveyed through the great doors and into a hall of such proportion that her footsteps seemed to echo with the melancholy of centuries. The walls rose toward a vaulted ceiling, and the floor beneath her feet was black and white marble, arranged in geometric precision. It was Blackwood who emerged from a corridor to the left, his expression suggesting the faintest satisfaction with how events had progressed. "Miss Wynne," he said, bowing with punctilious courtesy, "I trust your journey was not overly fatiguing. His Grace is awaiting your presence in the library. If you will permit me to conduct you?" Eleanor followed the solicitor through corridors that seemed to multiply infinitely, past walls adorned with portraits whose eyes seemed to track her passage, with expressions ranging from approval to skepticism. She found herself acutely aware of her modest provincial gown, of the worn quality of her gloves, of the absolute disparity between her own circumstances and the realm through which she now moved. The library, when they reached it, proved to be a space of almost impossible beauty. The walls rose 2 stories, lined entirely with volumes that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge and taste. A great fireplace dominated one wall, and it was before this fireplace that the Duke stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the flames with an expression of profound contemplation. "Miss Wynne," he said, turning to acknowledge her entrance, "you honor us with your presence. I perceive that Blackwood has offered you no explanation for this summons." "He has not, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice achieving a steadiness that surprised her own ears. "I confess myself somewhat bewildered by the nature of this invitation." The Duke smiled, and the expression transformed his countenance in a manner that Eleanor found both striking and unexpectedly tender. "A forthright response befitting your character. Come, sit. There are matters we must discuss, and I find that matters of substance are best addressed with candor, rather than the elaborate maneuvering that ordinarily attends discussions of delicate affairs." Eleanor settled herself in a chair positioned opposite his own, acutely aware of the disparity in their stations, yet finding in his manner something that suggested he did not regard such considerations as material to their conversation. "My brother," the Duke began, "has spoken of you with a frequency and an intensity that would be remarkable even were he given to loquacity, which he decidedly is not. He has informed me that you provided not merely the medical ministrations essential to his recovery, but something far more significant. You provided him with the assurance that he remained a man worthy of care, despite the circumstances that had reduced him to poverty and invalidism. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "I merely offered what any person of conscience would have offered, Your Grace. The circumstances of his arrival at my threshold created no impediment to the exercise of common charity." "And yet," the Duke continued, rising and moving toward the fireplace, "your charity was far from common, Miss Wynne. It was, by all accounts, extraordinary. It was constant despite the social censure that your actions invited. It was dignifying when circumstances might have rendered you inclined toward pity. In short, you treated my brother as a human being of worth when the world had rendered him invisible." He turned to face her fully, and Eleanor perceived in his expression something that transcended gratitude, something that spoke of a man confronting a truth that had shifted his understanding of fundamental matters. "I have come to understand," the Duke said slowly, "that Thomas's recovery was not merely physical, but moral and spiritual as well. He has described to me the manner in which you offered him tea each morning, not as charity dispensed from above, but as the acknowledgement of kinship between two human beings. He has described the constancy of your presence, and the way in which you permitted him to restore his own dignity through the simple act of accepting care without shame." Eleanor found her hands trembling. "Your brother is a man of considerable character, Your Grace. His recovery was natural, given the opportunity and the gentleness with which he was treated." "You are remarkably skillful at deflecting praise," the Duke observed, settling himself once more into his chair. "Yet I have not summoned you here to engage in the modest protestations that propriety ordinarily demands. I have summoned you because Thomas has made a request of me, and because I find myself compelled to accede to that request, despite all the considerations that would ordinarily counsel caution." Eleanor's breath caught. She understood, with a certainty that transcended the boundaries of rational interpretation, precisely what request Thomas had made. "My brother," the Duke continued, "has informed me that he has developed feelings for you that extend considerably beyond gratitude. He has further informed me that these feelings are reciprocated, insofar as such matters can be discerned, given the constraints of propriety that have ordinarily governed your interactions. He has asked me, as the head of our house, to convey to you that when the scandal attending these proceedings has sufficiently faded, a matter of months rather than years I would anticipate, he wishes to petition you for your hand in marriage." Eleanor felt as though the room itself had shifted upon its axis. She attempted to speak, found her voice insufficient to the magnitude of what was being articulated, and attempted again. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "I am a woman of no particular fortune or consequence. I cannot possibly be considered a suitable match for a gentleman of Mr. Harrowby's station." "And yet," the Duke replied with evident amusement, "it is Thomas who believes you to be the only suitable match for him. Thomas, I might add, is a man whose judgment I have learned to trust profoundly. Furthermore, I am not insensible to the fact that you have rendered a service to my house that exceeds what might ordinarily be expected of any person. You have restored to me a brother whom I had feared lost. That service demands acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement most dear to Thomas's heart is your acceptance of his suit." The Duke rose and moved to a painting that hung above the mantelpiece, a portrait of a woman rendered in the style of the previous generation. Eleanor recognized in the subject's features the unmistakable lineage of the Harrowby house. "This is our mother," the Duke said softly. "She was a woman of great dignity and profound compassion. She believed that nobility of character transcended nobility of birth, and that a person's value was determined not by their station, but by the integrity with which they met their obligations to others. I suspect she would have regarded you with considerable esteem, Miss Wynne." Eleanor rose on trembling legs and approached the portrait. The woman's eyes seemed to regard her with an expression of profound understanding, as though acknowledging something that Eleanor herself had only recently come to comprehend. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am overwhelmed by what you propose. I must know, does Mr. Harrowby truly wish this, or is this a matter of obligation, rendered by circumstance and gratitude?" The Duke smiled. "Thomas's feelings are beyond question. I have learned to interpret my brother's expressions with considerable accuracy, and I can assure you that when he speaks of you, his countenance illuminates in a manner that suggests emotions considerably more profound than mere gratitude." He moved to a small writing desk positioned against one wall and produced a letter sealed with wax, not the ducal seal, but a personal seal, elegant and understated. "He wrote this the evening after the magistrate's proceedings," the Duke explained, extending the letter toward Eleanor. "He instructed me to deliver it to you should you accept the invitation to Harrowby House. I find myself trusting that your response will justify my doing so." Eleanor took the letter with fingers that trembled almost beyond her capacity to control them. She did not open it immediately, but rather held it as though it were a sacred thing, something that might dissolve to dust were she to treat it without appropriate reverence. "There is one more matter," the Duke said, his tone shifting to something approaching solemnity. "I have made certain arrangements regarding your cottage and your modest circumstances. These arrangements take the form of an endowment, managed through Blackwood's office, which shall secure your independence and your financial security for the remainder of your life. Should you choose not to accept Thomas's suit, and I acknowledge that you retain the complete freedom to make such a choice, this endowment shall remain yours. Should you accept him, it shall serve as a wedding gift from the House of Harrowby, and as an acknowledgement of the debt we bear toward your kindness." Eleanor felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. "Your Grace, I cannot accept—" "You can and shall," the Duke interrupted gently, but with absolute firmness. "The matter is not subject to negotiation, Miss Wynne. You have given to my house something beyond price. We shall not permit you to refuse that which we offer in return." He gestured toward a door at the far end of the library. "There is a chamber prepared for you, the Rose Room, overlooking the gardens. You shall spend the night here, and tomorrow I shall convey you back to your cottage. You have my assurance that no one shall remark upon your sojourn at Harrowby House. When you have reached a decision regarding Thomas's petition, you may communicate that decision through Blackwood, and we shall proceed accordingly." Eleanor found herself conducted from the library in a daze of incomprehension and wonder. The Rose Room, when she reached it, proved to be a space of extraordinary beauty. Walls of pale rose damask, furnishings of mahogany and satin, a window overlooking gardens that even in darkness suggested infinite depth and complexity. It was only when she was alone, the door secured behind her, that Eleanor finally opened Thomas's letter. His writing was careful and deliberate, each word weighted with meaning. "My dearest Eleanor, I write to you as a man who has been restored not merely from affliction, but from the despair that had begun to convince me that such restoration was neither possible nor deserved. You have shown me that tenderness and dignity are not mutually exclusive, that a person may be reduced by circumstance without being diminished in worth, that love, when it emerges from genuine understanding rather than mere passion, possesses a strength that can endure any trial. I have no adequate words to express what your presence has meant to me. I can only say that when I contemplate my future, I find that it is only coherent when you occupy the center of it. With your permission, should you grant it, I wish to spend the remainder of my life demonstrating the depth of my commitment to your happiness and to the principle that has guided your actions, that true nobility resides not in rank, but in the steadfast dedication to goodness. My brother has been instructed to convey to you certain matters that I cannot address, while propriety demands our separation. I trust that you will receive his communication with the knowledge that every word springs from the profound truth of my regard for you. I remain, until you indicate otherwise, yours in devotion and eternal gratitude. Th. Eleanor held the letter to her heart and wept, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming realization that the life she had believed confined to the narrow boundaries of provincial obscurity had suddenly opened into infinite possibility. The carriage conveyed Eleanor back to her cottage as the morning fog descended once more upon the village, rendering the landscape into that ethereal realm between worlds where transformation seemed not merely possible, but inevitable. She carried with her the letter from Thomas, secured within her reticule, and the Duke's assurance that certain arrangements had been made which would alter the material circumstances of her life permanently. Yet as the carriage drew to a halt before her modest garden, Eleanor found that these considerations, however profound, seemed secondary to the simple fact that Thomas Harrowby had declared his love and that she had been granted the opportunity to accept it. The cottage seemed smaller now, yet somehow more precious, rendered sacred by the knowledge that within these walls a man had been restored from the very threshold of oblivion. She moved through the rooms methodically, opening shutters to the pale morning light, creating the order that had always provided her with the foundation for managing the overwhelming complexities of existence. It was as she was arranging flowers, a habit so ingrained that she scarcely noticed she was engaging in it, that Eleanor became aware of a visitor approaching her door. She recognized the figure immediately. The Duke, though he was not attired in the formal dress of his state, but rather in riding clothes that spoke of a man who had journeyed with purpose and haste. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, setting down her flowers with some haste, I did not anticipate, that is to say, your presence here is most unexpected." The Duke smiled, and Eleanor perceived in his expression something that transcended the formal courtesy she had observed the previous evening. It was something approaching warmth, even tenderness. "I have come," he said without preamble, "because my brother's impatience has exceeded the bounds of courtesy, and because I find myself inclined to indulge his wishes in this matter. He is awaiting your response with a degree of anxiety that borders upon the pathological. I have therefore taken it upon myself to convey to him, with whatever speed the condition of the roads permits, your answer." Eleanor felt her heart seem to compress within her chest. "Your Grace, I have not yet. That is to say, I have not formulated a response with sufficient clarity to warrant communication." "And yet," the Duke replied, moving toward the window and gazing out upon her modest garden, "your hesitation does not spring from any genuine doubt regarding your feelings. It springs rather from the conviction that acceptance would constitute an unwarranted overreach on your part, that you would be accepting a gift beyond your earning or your right." He turned to face her, and Eleanor perceived in his expression the accumulated authority of generations, yet deployed with a gentleness that rendered it almost unbearable. "Let me be explicit, Miss Wynne," the Duke continued. "You possess something that my brother requires for his restoration and his future happiness. That something is the assurance that he is capable of inspiring love in a person of integrity and discernment. You have provided him with that assurance through actions that cost you considerably. I do not believe that acceptance of his suit would constitute an unwarranted privilege on your part. I believe it would constitute the completion of a restoration that you began the moment you offered him warmth without judgment." Eleanor found herself unable to respond with anything more than a whisper. "I am afraid, Your Grace. I am afraid that I shall not prove equal to what would be required of me as his wife. I am afraid that my modest circumstances and my limited education will ultimately prove obstacles to his contentment." "You are afraid," the Duke replied, "for all the correct reasons. That fear speaks well of your character. But consider this, Miss Wynne. My brother has been restored by you to a state of wholeness that medical practitioners and family obligation could not achieve. He has learned from you that vulnerability is not weakness, that asking for help is not shame, and that love, true love, manifests not in grand gestures, but in the constancy of morning warmth, offered without expectation of return." He moved toward the door, and Eleanor perceived that he was preparing to depart. Yet before he reached the threshold, he paused and turned to regard her once more. "There is one more thing that I have brought you," he said, his tone shifting to something approaching ceremony. He produced a small parcel, wrapped in the finest tissue and secured with a ribbon of deep burgundy silk. Eleanor took the parcel, her fingers trembling as she carefully unwrapped it. Within lay a book, old leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully and perceived that it was a journal, filled with the careful handwriting of a woman long departed. "This was my mother's journal," the Duke explained. "It details her own thoughts regarding love, duty, and the nature of nobility. I have marked several passages that I believe would speak to your present circumstances. I wish you to read them, and in reading them to understand that your hesitation, while admirable, is not grounded in any genuine unsuitability on your part." He departed with such grace that Eleanor scarcely perceived the moment of his leaving. She stood alone in her cottage, the journal held before her like a sacred text, and opened it to the first marked passage. "The greatest nobility resides not in the giving of gifts, but in the receiving of them with gratitude and humility. A woman who accepts love offered by a man of worth does not diminish him. Rather, she permits him to complete his transformation from isolation into connection. There is no shame in this. There is only the fulfillment of what it means to be human." Eleanor sank into her chair, the journal open upon her lap, and allowed herself finally to acknowledge the full magnitude of what had been offered to her. Thomas loved her. The Duke believed her worthy of his brother's affection. The machinery of the Harrowby house had been set in motion to facilitate not merely her acceptance, but her absolute elevation beyond the circumstances of her birth. She drew forth quill and parchment and began to write. "My dearest Mr. Harrowby, I have spent the night and the greater part of this morning in contemplation of the extraordinary letter you conveyed to me through your brother. I have read it countless times, and with each reading I find myself more profoundly moved by the tenderness and the truth contained within it. I have permitted myself to be guided by fear for so long that I had nearly forgotten what courage feels like. But reading your words has reminded me that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the decision to move forward despite it. If you will have me, I accept your suit with a heart so full of gratitude and love that I fear words alone cannot contain it. I accept not because I believe myself unworthy, your brother has instructed me otherwise, but because I have come to understand that to refuse you would be to refuse the completion of my own transformation as much as yours. I remain, as I have always remained, yours in devotion. E.W. Winter descended upon the county with the authority of a monarch claiming its ancient throne, transforming the landscape into a realm of crystalline beauty and profound silence. Eleanor stood at the window of the Rose Room at Harrowby House, for she had been invited to remain as the honoured guest of the Duke whilst arrangements were finalised for her forthcoming marriage, and contemplated the gardens rendered white beneath their blanket of snow. 3 months had elapsed since the magistrate's proceedings, 3 months during which her life had undergone a transformation so absolute that she sometimes questioned whether the modest existence she had lived in her cottage had been reality, or merely a dream from which she had at last awakened. Yet the evidence of that former life remained present within her, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought her to this threshold. The worn gloves that had served her faithfully throughout years of provincial existence now lay carefully preserved in her chamber, treasured not as relics of poverty, but as testaments to the constancy that had ultimately proven more valuable than any abundance of fortune could have been. Thomas had been permitted to call upon her with increasing frequency, the constraints of propriety gradually loosening as the scandal attending the magistrate's proceedings faded into the autumn and winter months. They walked together through the Harrowby Gardens, their conversations ranging across territories both intellectual and deeply personal. Thomas spoke with evident passion regarding the estates that would eventually fall under his management, the improvements he wished to undertake, the manner in which he hoped to utilize his position to benefit those who depended upon the bounty of Harrowby lands. "I have been contemplating," he said to her one afternoon, as they stood together before the frost-covered fountain at the garden's centre, "the manner in which my former affliction has altered my understanding of privilege and obligation. When one has been stripped of agency, rendered vulnerable and dependent upon the charity of others, one gains a perspective upon suffering that cannot be acquired through mere intellectual exercise." Eleanor's hand rested upon his arm, and she felt the subtle tension of his muscles as he spoke. "You are transformed by your experience, Mr. Harrowby. You have emerged not as a man rendered bitter by what was inflicted upon you, but as one possessed of greater compassion for those who suffer." "I am transformed," Thomas agreed, turning to regard her with an intensity that rendered the winter afternoon seem almost warm, "because I was saved by transformation. Eleanor, I must speak plainly to you regarding a matter that has occupied my thoughts with increasing urgency. My brother has begun finalizing the arrangements for our marriage. The ceremony is to be conducted in the spring, when the gardens have begun their restoration to life. Yet I find myself deeply concerned regarding one matter." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety move through her. "What matter troubles you, sir?" "It is the question of your own wishes in this arrangement," Thomas said carefully. "I am aware that you have been subjected to considerable pressure from my brother, and that he has deployed his considerable influence to facilitate this union. I wish to know with absolute certainty that you are not merely acquiescing to the expectations of others, but that you genuinely desire to bind yourself to me in marriage." Eleanor turned to face him fully, and in the winter light she perceived the vulnerability that underlay his question, the fear that she might have accepted his suit from obligation rather than love. "Mr. Harrowby," she said softly, "I have accepted your suit because I have come to love you with a depth that surpasses my capacity to articulate. I love the man you were when you arrived at my threshold, broken and struggling to maintain dignity despite your circumstances. I love the man you have become through the restoration that we have undertaken together. I love your kindness, your intelligence, and your commitment to utilizing your position for the benefit of others. I would marry you were you a peasant without lands or fortune. That is the truth upon which I am prepared to stake my life." Thomas drew her close, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that spoke of profound restraint. In the frigid afternoon, surrounded by the crystalline beauty of the frozen garden, they stood together in a moment of perfect communion, two people who had traversed the darkness of doubt and emerged into the light of certainty. "Then we shall be married," Thomas said, his voice carrying the timbre of sacred oath, "and we shall begin the work of creating a life that honors the sacrifice you have made and the transformation that has brought us to this moment." It was on the following morning that Eleanor received a visitor of unexpected importance. Mrs. Lydia Renshaw appeared at Harrowby House, her expression suggesting a woman confronting circumstances that had rendered her previous certainties obsolete. Eleanor received her in the morning room, her composure absolute, yet her eyes bright with the knowledge of how thoroughly her life had been vindicated by events. "Miss Wynne," Mrs. Renshaw said, her voice carrying a strange quality of forced congeniality, "I have come to extend my congratulations upon your forthcoming marriage to Mr. Harrowby. It appears that the attachment between you has proven far more substantial than the village's initial speculations suggested." Eleanor inclined her head graciously. "I appreciate your good wishes, Mrs. Renshaw. I trust the parish has been well during the winter months." "Adequately," Mrs. Renshaw replied, her tone suggesting that the adequacy of the parish's condition was far less important than the matter of Eleanor's transformation in social standing. "I confess that I was mistaken in my initial assessment of your character. Your association with Mr. Harrowby was, as you suggested, entirely respectable and sanctioned by his family. I hope you will not harbor any ill will toward me for my former skepticism." Eleanor perceived in Mrs. Renshaw's words the complete capitulation of those who had formerly censured her, the sudden transformation of Eleanor from village scandal into person of consequence, worthy of respect and accommodation. She found that her capacity for vindictiveness had been exhausted by neither time nor circumstance. Instead, she felt only a gentle pity for the woman who had wielded her moral authority so carelessly, and whose standing now depended entirely upon the approval of those she had formerly condescended to judge. "I harbor no ill will, Mrs. Renshaw," Eleanor said with genuine kindness. "I understand that charity must be extended even to those who have failed to extend it themselves. I hope that we might begin afresh, and that the parish might discover in me a woman committed to the genuine welfare of those within it, rather than the maintenance of arbitrary standards." Mrs. Renshaw departed shortly thereafter, her purpose accomplished and her humiliation rendered complete through Eleanor's refusal to engage in anything approaching recrimination. The village, Eleanor understood, would soon speak of her with the reverence ordinarily reserved for those of established position. Yet she felt no triumph in this transformation. She felt only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had remained true to her principles, despite the temptation to compromise them. The weeks leading toward spring unfolded with the languor of a life being consciously lived rather than merely endured. Eleanor studied the accounts that would eventually fall under her management as mistress of the Harrowby estates. She worked with the housekeeper to understand the intricacies of managing a household of such magnitude. She read extensively in the library, drawing upon centuries of accumulated wisdom and beauty to expand her comprehension of the world beyond her modest cottage. Yet it was in the quiet moments, in the early mornings when she walked alone through the gardens, in the evenings when she read by the fire in her chamber, in the conversations conducted with Thomas beneath the bare branches of winter-stripped trees, that Eleanor perceived most fully the manner in which her life had been transformed. She had not merely moved from poverty into wealth. She had moved from invisibility into recognition, from isolation into genuine connection, from the narrow certainty of provincial life into the vast landscape of possibility that genuine love creates. On the day before her wedding, Eleanor stood once more in the rose room and gazed out upon the gardens now beginning their slow emergence from winter's grip. The crocuses were pushing through the snow, and the first brave buds were visible upon the branches of the fruit trees. Spring was approaching, a season of renewal and restoration, bringing with it the promise of transformation accomplished. She touched her fingers to the silver ring that remained upon her hand, hidden beneath her glove, and thought of the morning when a shivering man had appeared at her threshold, and she had offered him the only gift she possessed, her compassion, offered without expectation of reward. That morning had changed everything. It had transformed her from a woman of modest circumstances into a woman of consequence, but more importantly, it had transformed her from a woman who believed her life was too small to matter into a woman who understood that every act of kindness, however humble, possessed the power to alter destinies. The chapel at Harrowby House stood as a sanctuary of stone and stained glass, its ancient walls bearing witness to centuries of solemn ceremonies and sacred moments. On the morning of her wedding, Eleanor moved through its threshold transformed by the particular alchemy that transforms an ordinary woman into a bride. Her gown of ivory silk speaking of purity and hope, her hair adorned with the tiny white flowers that had bloomed impossibly early within the Harrowby gardens, as though nature itself had conspired to acknowledge the significance of this union. The chapel was filled with the assembled gentry of the county, those whose curiosity regarding the marriage of a ducal younger son to a woman of no particular fortune had overcome their customary discretion. Eleanor perceived their eyes fixed upon her, with expressions ranging from approbation to skepticism, yet she found that their judgment, whether favorable or otherwise, had ceased to possess any power over her sense of her own worth. Thomas stood at the altar, and as Eleanor moved toward him down the aisle lined with candles and flowers, she perceived his expression transform into something so profound that it seemed to encompass the entirety of their journey together. His eyes held hers with absolute focus, rendering the assembled gathering utterly insignificant, creating a space in which only the two of them existed in any meaningful capacity. The vicar, an elderly gentleman of considerable compassion and theological sophistication, intoned the traditional words that bound two lives into singular purpose. Yet it was Thomas's voice that Eleanor heard most clearly, as he spoke the vows that ordinarily passed unnoticed in the ceremonial recitation of sacred formulas. "I, Thomas Adrian Harrowby, take thee, Eleanor Margaret Wynne, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady and absolute, "to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I plight thee my troth." As he spoke these words, Eleanor perceived in them not the mere recitation of ceremony, but the profound acknowledgement of all that had transpired between them, the recognition that he had known her in her absolute vulnerability, and that he had chosen to love her not in spite of her circumstances, but with full acknowledgement of the transformation those circumstances had forged within her spirit. When Eleanor spoke her own vows, her voice carried a trembling quality that suggested the magnitude of what she was undertaking. She spoke not merely to Thomas, but to the God whom she had learned to trust through the constancy of her own conscience, and to the woman she had been, the modest, invisible woman of her cottage, and to the woman she was becoming. "I, Eleanor Margaret Wynne, take thee, Thomas Adrian Harrowby, to be my husband," she said, and her voice seemed to fill the chapel with a resonance that transcended the ordinary acoustics of stone and space. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth." It was as the vicar proclaimed them bound in holy matrimony that Eleanor perceived seated in the front pew alongside the Duke the figure of a woman of advanced years, whose eyes held the particular depth of one who had witnessed much and understood more. It was, Eleanor would later learn, the Duke's aunt, a woman of considerable independence and considerable wealth, who had made the journey from London upon learning of the union between her nephew and the woman whose compassion had saved his brother's life. The ceremony concluded with the traditional blessing, and as Eleanor and Thomas processed from the chapel, the assembled gathering erupted into the congratulations that ordinarily attended such occasions. Yet Eleanor found her attention drawn repeatedly toward the elderly woman, whose expression suggested a recognition of something that transcended the ordinary pageantry of wedding ceremony. It was at the wedding breakfast, conducted in the great hall of Harrowby House, that this woman, the Dowager Lady Harrowby, as Eleanor learned she was styled, approached her with evident purpose. "My dear," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection, "I have heard from my nephew Adrian a great deal regarding you. He speaks of you with a regard that he ordinarily reserves for matters of considerable substance. I wish to observe you for myself, to ascertain whether you are indeed the woman of character and integrity that he has described." Eleanor found herself suddenly trembling in the presence of this elderly gentlewoman, aware that she was being subjected to a scrutiny that transcended the ordinary courtesy of familial greeting. "I am honored by the interest you have taken, Lady Harrowby," Eleanor said carefully. "I hope I prove worthy of the regard your nephew has extended toward me." "Worthy," the Dowager repeated, and a smile moved across her features that suggested profound satisfaction. "My dear, you are far more than worthy. You are, in fact, precisely what my family requires, a woman who understands that true nobility resides not in rank or fortune, but in the steadfast dedication to goodness and the courage to love, despite circumstances that might counsel caution." She reached into her reticule and produced a small leather case, which she pressed into Eleanor's hands. "These belong to my mother," she explained. They were left to me with the instruction that they should be given to a woman who embodied the virtues that our family has, at its best, represented. When Adrian described you to me, I knew immediately who that woman was to be. Eleanor opened the case with trembling fingers and perceived within it a set of jewels of extraordinary beauty, emeralds and pearls arranged in settings of white gold that seemed to capture and refract light in infinite variations. "These are far too valuable, Lady Harrowby," Eleanor began, but the Dowager interrupted her with a gesture of absolute finality. "They are precisely the value appropriate to a woman who has transformed not merely my nephew's life, but the character of the entire Harrowby house. Do not diminish their importance by protest. Rather, wear them as a recognition of the truth that your presence has disclosed to our family that we are all of us capable of transformation, and that the catalyst for that transformation often arrives in the most unexpected forms." She kissed Eleanor upon the cheek, a gesture of affection so genuine that it seemed to seal something fundamental between them, and departed to engage in the various social obligations that attended the wedding breakfast. Eleanor stood for a long moment, the jeweled case secure in her hands, and felt the magnitude of what had been accomplished begin to make itself apparent. She had not merely married a man of rank and consequence, she had been acknowledged by the most elevated authority within the Harrowby family as worthy of carrying forward the name and the values that that family represented. Later, as the evening descended and the initial festivities began to wane, Thomas found her in the small library, not the great library where she had received his brother's initial communication, but a smaller, more intimate space that overlooked the gardens. "You are contemplative," he observed, settling himself beside her in the candle-lit darkness. "Does your heart harbor any regrets regarding what you have undertaken this day?" "Only the regret," Eleanor replied, "that I cannot simultaneously inhabit the woman I was and the woman I have become. For the woman I was, modest and invisible, deserves to know the joy that the woman I have become is experiencing." Thomas drew her close, and Eleanor felt the absolute security that comes from being held by someone who has known you in your deepest vulnerability and chosen to love you despite it, or rather, because of it. "Then let us ensure that the woman you were is remembered and honored," Thomas said softly. "Let us ensure that your transformation becomes a testament to what is possible when compassion is permitted to guide our actions, and when love is allowed to transcend the arbitrary boundaries that society erects around human possibility." In the darkness of the library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom, Eleanor permitted herself to experience the profound gratitude that had sustained her throughout this extraordinary journey. She had offered tea to a stranger on a cold morning, and that simple act had transformed 2 lives, restored a family to wholeness, and granted her entry into a realm of possibility she had scarcely dared to imagine. It was, she understood, the greatest gift that life could offer, the knowledge that her actions mattered, that her presence had significance, and that the smallest gestures of kindness possessed the power to alter destinies. 5 years had elapsed since the morning when Eleanor first offered tea to the shivering man at her cottage threshold. 5 years of seasons turning, of transformation accumulating in layers like the pages of a book, gradually being written across the landscape of a life. Eleanor stood now in the gardens of Harrowby House, no longer the timid visitor to whom the Duke had extended his invitation, but rather the mistress of these grounds, charged with their care and their perpetual restoration. Yet the transformation that had occurred within the gardens paled in comparison to the transformation that had occurred within Eleanor herself. She was no longer the modest woman of provincial obscurity. She was the mistress of Harrowby, a woman of considerable standing within the county, known not for her rank but for the particular quality of compassion that she had brought to bear upon the welfare of those who depended upon Harrowby generosity. It was Thomas's idea to create what they called the Garden of Remembrance, a space within the broader grounds dedicated to the commemoration of their journey from separation into union, from isolation into genuine connection. The garden had been designed according to Eleanor's specifications, and it had developed over the 5 years into something approaching architectural poetry. At its center stood a fountain, not elaborate or pretentious, but simple and elegant, fed by natural springs that emerged from deep within the Harrowby lands. Around this fountain, Eleanor had planted flowers in deliberate succession, crocuses that emerged first in spring, speaking of hope and awakening, violets that bloomed in spring's deepening, suggesting modesty and gentle strength, irises that arrived with summer, symbolizing courage and wisdom, and finally, madresilva, honeysuckle, trained to climb the stone walls that enclosed the garden, its sweet fragrance speaking of devotion and the binding of souls. It was within this garden that Eleanor had given birth to her first child, not literally, though the poetry of that image seemed appropriate to the manner in which the garden had become the heart of her transformed existence. Rather, it was within this space that she had come to understand the full magnitude of what love could accomplish when love was permitted to guide action without the interference of fear or doubt. Her daughter, now 4 years of age, played at the edge of the fountain with the particular unself-consciousness of a child born into abundance and security. The child bore her father's dark hair and her mother's grey-green eyes, a physical embodiment of the union between two people whose connection transcended ordinary categories of social standing or material circumstance. Thomas approached across the garden, moving with the ease and confidence that had characterized him for these 5 years of restored health and purpose. In his hands, he carried a small box, and Eleanor perceived in his expression that peculiar quality of tender anticipation that had become familiar to her throughout their marriage. "I have brought you something," he said, settling himself beside her upon the bench positioned to overlook the fountain. "It arrived this morning from London, though it was commissioned more than a year ago. I have been waiting for precisely the right moment to present it to you." Eleanor opened the box with the care she had learned to bring to all significant moments, and perceived within it an object of extraordinary beauty and poignancy. It was a ring, fashioned from white gold in the style of the previous generation, bearing upon its face a seal that was neither the ducal crest of the Harrowby house nor the personal seal that Thomas wore, but rather something entirely new, a seal that incorporated elements of both, woven together in such a manner that neither superseded the other. Instead, they existed in perfect harmony, their separate elements unified into singular purpose. "This seal," Thomas explained, taking the ring from the box and positioning it upon Eleanor's finger beside the simple gold band that had marked their wedding day, represents the union of two souls whose separate journeys led them to a single destination. It contains within it the Harrowby crest, the symbol of rank and duty and ancient obligation. But it contains as well a new symbol, one that I have designed specifically to honor your journey. A teacup, fashioned from the same white gold as the seal, rendered with such miniature precision that it is scarcely visible unless one knows to look for it. Eleanor gasped, perceiving now with Thomas's guidance the tiny teacup woven into the design of the seal. It was there, absolutely present, yet so expertly concealed that it seemed to exist in a realm between visibility and invisibility, a perfect metaphor for the manner in which her own transformation had occurred. "Every person who regards this ring," Thomas continued, "will perceive the Harrowby seal and recognize the authority and standing that it represents. But you will know that the true power of this seal resides in that small teacup, in the knowledge that the greatest transformation in both our lives emerged not from rank or fortune, but from the humble offering of warmth and dignity in a moment when such things seemed impossible." Eleanor found herself weeping, tears that fell not from sorrow but from the overwhelming recognition of the extraordinary care with which Thomas had woven the story of their meeting into the very substance of the ring she now wore. "There is one more matter," Thomas said, his voice shifting to something approaching solemnity. "I have been in correspondence with the authorities regarding a proposal that I wish to bring before you for your approval. I wish to establish in your name a foundation dedicated to the care and rehabilitation of persons who have been reduced by circumstance to poverty and invalidism. It will be called, if you permit it, the Eleanor Harrowby Institute for the Restoration of Human Dignity." Eleanor felt as though the world itself had shifted upon its axis. The notion that her name, once a whisper uttered with moral censure by Mrs. Renshaw and her associates, would become the foundation of an institution dedicated to the care of those society had abandoned, seemed almost unbearably poignant. "The Institute will provide not merely material assistance," Thomas continued, "but the sort of care that you provided to me, care that honors the human dignity of those who receive it, that recognizes that compassion is not charity dispensed from above, but rather the acknowledgement of kinship between human beings. Each person admitted to the Institute will receive not only medical care and material sustenance, but also the assurance that they are worthy of such care, that their circumstances do not diminish their fundamental value as human beings." Eleanor perceived in this proposal the full flowering of what she and Thomas had begun in those early mornings at her cottage, the transformation of a private act of compassion into something approaching a moral principle, a way of understanding human obligation that might ultimately alter the course of society itself. "How could I refuse such an honor?" Eleanor asked softly. "How could I refuse to lend my name to a project that embodies the very principles by which I have endeavored to live?" The child who was their daughter approached at this moment, drawn by some intuition toward the profound emotion that seemed to saturate the air around her parents. Eleanor drew the child close, and the three of them sat together in the garden that had become the visible embodiment of their journey from separation into wholeness. As the afternoon light shifted across the garden, rendering the flowers into burnished gold and profound shadow, Eleanor reflected upon the extraordinary path that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a woman of no consequence, living in a modest cottage in a provincial village. She had offered tea to a stranger, guided by nothing more than the ordinary impulse of conscience. And that simple act had transformed not merely her own life, but the lives of all those whom she had subsequently touched. She understood now the truth that her father had attempted to teach her in his final years, that true nobility resides not in rank or fortune, but in the steadfast commitment to goodness despite circumstance. She understood that the smallest gestures of compassion possess the power to alter destinies. She understood that love, when permitted to guide action, could transcend every boundary that society erects to separate human beings from one another. Most importantly, she understood that she was not a woman who had been elevated from obscurity to prominence. Rather, she was a woman who had always possessed value, and who had finally encountered circumstances and individuals willing to acknowledge that value and permit it to flourish. The teacup upon her ring caught the light, rendering it briefly visible before light and shadow transformed it once more into invisibility. Eleanor smiled, touching the ring gently with the tips of her fingers, and felt the presence of all that it represented, all that she had been, all that she had become, and all that she might yet accomplish through the patient exercise of compassion and the steadfast dedication to love. Behind her, the fountain continued its gentle murmur, and the flowers arranged themselves in their eternal cycle of blooming and fading, reminding all who witnessed them that transformation was not a destination to be reached, but rather a perpetual process through which the human heart learned gradually to recognize its own capacity for infinite growth and boundless grace. The moral of the story, a reflection on compassion and worth. Dear beloved listeners, this story has carried us through a journey far deeper than the surface narrative of romance and social elevation. It has asked us to contemplate a fundamental truth that our modern world often forgets, that compassion offered without expectation of reward is not merely a virtue, but a form of moral alchemy, the capacity to transform not only the recipient of kindness, but the giver herself. Eleanor Wynne began her journey believing herself small, invisible, inconsequential. She believed that her life could matter only within the narrow boundaries of her provincial cottage, that her worth was determined by the judgments of those around her. Yet in a single moment, when she chose to extend warmth to a stranger despite the warnings of a disapproving society, she discovered a profound truth, that human worth is not bestowed by society or circumstance. It is inherent, unchanging, and recognizable only when encountered through the lens of authentic compassion. The story reveals to us that true nobility, the nobility that transcends rank, fortune, and social standing, emerges from the heart's capacity to see another human being with clarity and without judgment. When Eleanor offered tea to Thomas, she did not see a vagrant or a threat to her reputation. She saw a person in pain, and she responded to that person's pain with her full humanity. In doing so, she taught Thomas, and through him, his brother and his entire family, that dignity cannot be conferred by title or wealth. Dignity is something that emerges when one person acknowledges the inherent worth of another. We live in a world that increasingly measures human value through metrics of accomplishment, wealth, and status. We are taught that we must earn our worth through productivity and success. But this story offers a counter-narrative, a narrative that suggests that worth is something far more fundamental, something that exists before achievement, beneath circumstance, independent of the judgments that others render upon us. Eleanor's transformation was not truly a transformation at all in the most profound sense. Rather, it was a revelation of what had always been true about her. She had always possessed the capacity for deep love, for unwavering commitment to goodness, for the exercise of moral courage despite social censure. She had always been worthy of love, of recognition, of elevation. The world simply had not yet perceived what her heart had always known. This is the moral that we offer to you, that you too possess within yourself an inherent worth that transcends your circumstances. Your value is not determined by your social standing, your financial resources, or the recognition you receive from others. Your value resides in your capacity to love, to act with compassion, and to maintain commitment to goodness, even when doing so places you at odds with those around you. Furthermore, this story asks us to recognize that the smallest gestures of compassion possess the power to alter the course of human lives. Eleanor did not set out to transform anyone. She did not offer tea because she believed it would lead to marriage, wealth, or social elevation. She offered tea because a human being was suffering, and she possessed the capacity to alleviate that suffering. Yet in that single, repeated gesture, she set in motion a chain of events that transformed not merely her own life, but the lives of Thomas, Adrian, and countless others who would subsequently benefit from the Eleanor Harrowby Institute for the Restoration of Human Dignity. We live in an age of grand gestures and public displays of virtue. We are tempted to believe that our actions matter only insofar as they are recognized and celebrated by others. This story invites us to reconsider that belief. It invites us to understand that the most profound moral acts often occur in silence, witnessed only by the person performing them and the person receiving them. It invites us to exercise compassion, not for the sake of recognition, but for the sake of love, for the sake of honoring the inherent worth of another human being. Finally, this story reminds us that love, true love, not the superficial sentiment that passes for love in much of contemporary culture, is not something that is earned through effort or achievement. True love is something that is recognized and honored when one person perceives the authentic self of another and chooses to commit themselves to the flourishing of that person. Eleanor did not earn Thomas's love through strategic action or calculated effort. She earned it through the simple act of being authentically herself, of offering genuine compassion without pretense or hidden agenda. And in so doing, she made it possible for Thomas to perceive his own worth and to commit himself to a life of mutual devotion and shared purpose. Let this story serve as an invitation to examine your own heart. Ask yourself, where in your life are you being called to extend compassion despite fear? Where are you being invited to see beyond the surface judgments that your community makes, and to perceive the inherent worth of those who are being overlooked or condemned? Where might your own small gesture of kindness set in motion a chain of transformation whose full consequences you may never comprehend? The answer to these questions will guide you toward the moral life, toward the life of genuine nobility that transcends all external circumstances. Dear cherished listeners, if this story has touched your heart, if the journey of Eleanor and Thomas has stirred within you a recognition of love's transformative power, we invite you to join our community of devoted listeners. Please subscribe to the Victorian Romance audio stories channel to receive new stories of passion, virtue, and redemption delivered directly to your heart. Each story offers a portal into the world of genuine emotion and moral clarity that our contemporary world desperately requires. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Eleanor's journey. How has this story affected you? Which moment moved you most deeply? Have you encountered moments in your own life where a small gesture of compassion transformed a relationship or altered a trajectory? We treasure your reflections, and we read each comment with the same care and attention that we bring to the creation of our stories. Ring the notification bell so that you never miss a new release. Our stories arrive with the regularity of the changing seasons, bringing with them the promise of adventure, romance, and the profound recognition of what it means to love with authenticity and courage. Share this story with those in your life who would benefit from its message, those who are struggling to perceive their own worth, those who need to be reminded that compassion matters, those who long for stories that affirm the possibility of genuine transformation through love. The Victorian Romance audio stories community is a gathering place for souls who believe that literature possesses the power to elevate consciousness, to restore faith in human possibility, and to remind us of what we are capable of becoming when we permit love to guide our actions. We eagerly await your return to our channel, and we look forward to sharing with you many more stories of passion, virtue, and the extraordinary transformations that love makes possible. On behalf of the entire Victorian Romance audio stories team, we wish to extend our profound thanks to you for permitting us to share this story with you. Your presence, your attention, and your willingness to journey with Eleanor and Thomas through their remarkable transformation represents a gift beyond measure. We are grateful for your trust in our work. We are grateful for the communities of listeners around the world who have made our mission possible. The mission of preserving and celebrating the profound emotional truths that Victorian literature communicates with such extraordinary eloquence. We look forward to welcoming you back to our channel for future stories of love, honor, and the transformative power of genuine compassion. With admiration and gratitude, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team.